Good evening. Tonight, we're going to trace one of the most fascinating transformations in the history of mythology, the evolution of Lilith from a nameless desert wind into one of the most complex and contested figures in Western occult tradition. When most people hear the name Lilith today, they think of a symbol of female empowerment, sexual autonomy, or feminist rebellion. But that's a very modern reading, and one that would have horrified the people who actually believed in her for thousands of years. For most of history, Lilith wasn't inspiring. She was terrifying. She was the thing that killed your baby in the night. She was the shadow at the edge of your bed. She was the demon mothers prayed against and midwives warded off with amulets and spells. So how did we get from there to here? How did a child-killing night demon become a symbol of liberation? That's the journey we're taking tonight. And it begins not in a garden, not in the Bible, but in the deserts of ancient Mesopotamia, thousands of years before anyone had ever heard the name Lilith at all. Let's go back to the beginning. We have to start in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE. This is a world of city-states, cuneiform tablets, and a cosmos absolutely teeming with invisible forces. The ancient Mesopotamians didn't just believe in gods. They believed in an entire ecology of spirits, demons, and invisible beings that inhabited the night, the wilderness, the wind, and the spaces between human settlements. Among these beings were the Lilu and the Lilitu, male and female night spirits. The word itself probably comes from a Sumerian or Akkadian root meaning wind or spirit. These weren't gods. They weren't worshipped. They were feared. The Lilu and Lilitu were creatures of the threshold, beings that existed in liminal spaces. The edge of the desert. The hours between dusk and dawn. The boundary between sleep and waking. And they were dangerous. What did these spirits do? According to Mesopotamian incantation texts, they attacked people at night. Specifically, they targeted 3 groups: pregnant women, newborns, and sleeping men. Why those 3? Because they represent the most vulnerable moments in human life, the moments when the boundary between life and death, between consciousness and unconsciousness, is thinnest. For pregnant women and newborns, the danger was obvious. Infant mortality in the ancient world was catastrophically high. Mothers died in childbirth constantly. When a baby died suddenly in the night, what we'd call SIDS today, there had to be an explanation. And the explanation was, something came in the dark and took the child. For men, the danger was different, and more explicitly sexual. The Lilitu was thought to seduce sleeping men, causing nocturnal emissions and disturbing their rest. This is important because it establishes a pattern we'll see again and again: Lilith as a figure of erotic danger, of sexuality that exists outside the bounds of marriage and procreation. Now, the Lilu and Lilitu weren't the only dangerous spirits in Mesopotamian demonology. There was another figure who's crucial to understanding how Lilith develops: Lamashtu. Lamashtu was a full-fledged demoness with her own iconography, her own mythology. She was depicted as a creature with a lion's head, donkey's teeth, bird's talons, and naked breasts, nursing a pig and a dog no less. Charming. And what did Lamashtu do? She preyed on pregnant women and infants. She was specifically invoked as the cause of miscarriages, stillbirths, and sudden infant death. There are entire classes of Mesopotamian amulets designed to protect against her. Lamashtu is important because she establishes the template, the pattern of the child-killing demoness that will eventually be mapped onto Lilith. Even though Lamashtu and Lilith are separate figures with separate origins, they belong to the same cultural category, the thing that kills babies in the night. Around 2000 BCE, we get something particularly intriguing. There's a Sumerian poem called Gilgamesh and the Hulapu tree. In this story, a sacred tree is inhabited by 3 creatures: a serpent in the roots, a bird in the branches, and a female being in the middle. This female being is described as Ki-Sikalilaku, which some scholars translate as Lilith-like, or even as Lilith herself. She's described as shrieking, as wild, as refusing to leave the tree until the hero Gilgamesh drives her out into the wilderness. Now, here's where it gets tricky. Some scholars absolutely love this connection. They see it as Proto-Lilith, a figure who inhabits sacred space, who's connected to wildness and chaos, and who gets expelled. It fits the later pattern perfectly. But other scholars are more cautious. The word Ki-Sikalilaku is difficult to translate, and it might just mean maiden of desolation or woman of the wind, without any direct connection to what Lilith will become. The evidence is fragmentary, the language is ambiguous, and we're looking at a text that's nearly 4,000 years old. What we can say is this: whether or not the Hulapu tree figure is Lilith, it shows that the type of figure she represents, a wild, shrieking feminine presence associated with trees, wilderness and disruption, was already present in ancient Near Eastern mythology. The pieces are being assembled. But the name, the story, the singular character of Lilith? That's still centuries away. Fast forward now to the Hebrew Bible, to the book of Isaiah, chapter 34. The prophet Isaiah is delivering a judgment oracle against Edom, describing its total desolation after God's wrath. And among the list of creatures that will inhabit the ruins, we get this: there shall the Lilith repose, and find for herself a resting place. That's it. One line. One word. Lilith. This is the only mention of Lilith in the entire Hebrew Bible. She appears in a list of desert animals and demons, alongside jackals, ostriches, goat demons, and other creatures of desolation. She's one horror among many, not the star of the show. Here's the problem: nobody's entirely sure what Lilith means in this context. When ancient translators tried to render this word into other languages, they struggled. The Septuagint, the Greek translation, renders it as Onacantauros, a kind of donkey centaur. The Latin Vulgate calls her Lamia, borrowing from Greek mythology. Modern English translations are all over the place: night monster, night creature, screech owl, night bird. Why the confusion? Because Lilith is what's called a hapax legomenon, a word that appears only once in the entire biblical corpus. Without other contexts, you're just guessing based on cognates and cultural context. But even in this uncertainty, there's a clue. The word clearly shares a root with the Mesopotamian Lilitu. The Israelites inherited the concept from their neighbors, the sense that there was something dangerous, feminine, and nocturnal prowling the wilderness. Even though the biblical reference is minimal, ancient and medieval Jewish readers didn't just shrug and move on. They knew who Lilith was. Or at least, they knew what kind of thing she was. The Targum, the Aramaic translation and interpretation of the Bible, already treats Lilith as a night demon, a dangerous female spirit. Early Jewish commentaries link her explicitly to the Mesopotamian traditions we talked about earlier. By the rabbinic period, Lilith has a reputation. She's not a major figure in mainstream biblical theology, but she's present in the folk tradition, in the world of practical magic and protective rituals. Before we leave the ancient period, I want to mention one more piece of evidence, though it's controversial. There's a 7th century BCE plaque from Arslan Tash in Syria, written in Phoenician, that may mention Lilith. It includes an incantation against a flying one or strangler, possibly Lilith, along with imagery of demonic creatures devouring children. Some scholars argue this is one of the earliest references to Lilith by name. Others think the reading is uncertain and the connection is speculative. What's not debatable is the type of artifact. This is a protective amulet, designed to be hung in a home to ward off child-killing demons. And that pattern, amulets against nocturnal threats to children, is going to become absolutely central to Lilith's story. Let's jump forward to late antiquity, the period from roughly the 3rd to the 7th centuries CE. This is the world of the Talmud, of early Christianity, of late Roman and early Islamic culture. And in this world, Lilith is everywhere, not in scripture, not in official theology, but in the realm of practical magic. Archaeologists have found hundreds of incantation bowls from this period, especially in Babylonia. These are ceramic bowls inscribed with magical formulas, then buried upside down under the thresholds or in the corners of houses. And what are these bowls protecting against? Again and again, Lilith. Or the Lilin, the plural form, her demonic offspring or associates. The language of these bowls is fascinating. They don't just ask for protection, they command. They bind. They threaten. Bound are the Lilin and sealed are the demons, one bowl reads. Another, I adjure you, Lilith, in the name of the Lord, that you shall not enter this house. Some bowls name specific people, women about to give birth, newborn infants, newlywed couples. The threats Lilith poses are clear: she causes miscarriage, stillbirth, infant death, and sexual dysfunction. She's also blamed for illness, sleeplessness, and nightmares, all the things that happen in the vulnerable hours of darkness when you can't see what's happening. This is lived religion. This is what people actually did when they were afraid. They didn't consult scripture, they called the local magician, commissioned a bowl, and buried it under their doorway. Some of these incantation bowls include drawings. And in those drawings, we get some of the earliest visual representations of Lilith. She's shown with wild, loose hair, significant because respectable women covered their hair. She's sometimes bound in chains, sometimes nude, sometimes accompanied by animal features or surrounded by protective symbols. These images are crude, scratched into clay by hand. But they're powerful because they show that Lilith was conceived as an individual being, not just an abstract force. She could be depicted, named, and most importantly, bound. By this point, Lilith exists at the intersection of three traditions: Mesopotamian demon lore, the ancient roots, the Lilitu and the dangerous night spirits. A fleeting biblical reference, one line in Isaiah that gave her scriptural legitimacy. A rich magical tradition, incantation bowls, amulets, and folk practices. But she's still not a character with a story. She's a force, a threat, a name invoked in spells. That's about to change. Alright, now we get to the big one, the story that most people associate with Lilith today. Here's the setup: if you read Genesis carefully, there's a problem. In Genesis 1 verse 27, God creates humanity. Male and female He created them. Then in Genesis 2, God creates Adam first, then later creates Eve from Adam's rib. So which is it? Were they created together, or was Adam created first? For most of Jewish and Christian history, this wasn't seen as a contradiction, just two perspectives on the same event. But for ancient and medieval interpreters who believed Scripture was perfect and precise, this raised a question. What if there were two creations? What if the woman from Genesis 1, the one created equally with Adam, was someone else? Enter the alphabet of Ben Sira, a medieval Jewish text from somewhere between the 8th and 10th centuries CE. This text is weird. It's satirical, it's crude, it's full of scatological humor and irreverent takes on biblical figures. It's not scripture, not Talmud, not respectable rabbinic literature. It's more like medieval fanfiction. And in this text, we get the story that changes everything. According to the alphabet, when God created Adam, He also created a woman from the earth, just like Adam. Her name was Lilith. Adam and Lilith immediately began to fight. Why? Because Lilith refused to lie beneath Adam during sex. We are equal, Lilith says, for we are both made from the earth. Adam demands that she submit. Lilith refuses. And here's the crucial moment: Lilith speaks the divine name, the secret powerful name of God, and she flies away from Eden. Adam complains to God. God sends 3 angels, Sinoi, Sansonoi, and Samangelof, to bring her back. They find her by the Red Sea, surrounded by demons. The angels threaten her, return or die. Lilith refuses. Instead, she makes a deal: she will prey on human infants, but she will spare any child protected by an amulet bearing the angels' names. And that's the origin story. That's how Lilith becomes Adam's first wife, the woman who refused to submit, the rebellious figure who chose wilderness and demons over obedience in Eden. Alright, now we get to the big one, the story that most people associate with Lilith today. Here's the setup: if you read Genesis carefully, there's a problem. In Genesis 1 verse 27, God creates humanity. Male and female He created them. Then in Genesis 2, God creates Adam first, then later creates Eve from Adam's rib. So which is it? Were they created together, or was Adam created first? For most of Jewish and Christian history, this wasn't seen as a contradiction, just two perspectives on the same event. But for ancient and medieval interpreters who believed Scripture was perfect and precise, this raised a question. What if there were two creations? What if the woman from Genesis 1, the one created equally with Adam, was someone else? Enter the alphabet of Ben Sira, a medieval Jewish text from somewhere between the 8th and 10th centuries CE. This text is weird. It's satirical, it's crude, it's full of scatological humor and irreverent takes on biblical figures. It's not scripture, not Talmud, not respectable rabbinic literature. It's more like medieval fanfiction. And in this text, we get the story that changes everything. According to the alphabet, when God created Adam, He also created a woman from the earth, just like Adam. Her name was Lilith. Adam and Lilith immediately began to fight. Why? Because Lilith refused to lie beneath Adam during sex. We are equal, Lilith says, for we are both made from the earth. Adam demands that she submit. Lilith refuses. And here's the crucial moment: Lilith speaks the divine name, the secret powerful name of God, and she flies away from Eden. Adam complains to God. God sends 3 angels, Sinoi, Sansonoi, and Samangelof, to bring her back. They find her by the Red Sea, surrounded by demons. The angels threaten her, return or die. Lilith refuses. Instead, she makes a deal. She will prey on human infants, but she will spare any child protected by an amulet bearing the angels' names. And that's the origin story. That's how Lilith becomes Adam's first wife, the woman who refused to submit, the rebellious figure who chose wilderness and demons over obedience in Eden. Let's pause and think about what this story does. First, it solves a textual problem, the apparent contradiction in Genesis. But more importantly, it creates a new mythological figure, a woman who is Adam's equal, who demanded equality, and who was punished and demonized for it. In the context of medieval Jewish culture, this was not a feminist story. This was a cautionary tale. Lilith was the bad example, the woman who refused her proper role, who spoke out of turn, who chose independence over submission. She became a demon because she rebelled. But notice what the story also does, it gives Lilith agency. She makes a choice. She has desires, demands, and power. She's not a passive victim, she's an active, defiant force. That ambiguity, that tension between condemnation and admiration, between villainess and heroine, is what makes Lilith so compelling. And it's why the story resonates so differently in different eras. Now the alphabet of Ben Sira does something very clever. It takes the old tradition of Lilith as a child-killing demon and gives it a new explanation. Before, Lilith attacked babies because, well, that's just what night demons do. But now there's a story behind it. Lilith kills human children because she's angry, because she's been rejected, because this is her revenge against Adam and Eve and all their descendants. The text says that Lilith gives birth to 100 demon children every day, and every day, 100 of them die. So she kills human infants in retaliation, trying to balance the scale of her own endless loss. This is a much more emotionally complex figure than the old Mesopotamian Lilitu. She's not just a mindless threat, she's a grieving, vengeful mother, eternally repeating her own trauma on others. Medieval Jewish communities took this story seriously. It became part of the folk tradition, repeated in commentaries, expanded in later texts, and most importantly, acted upon in daily life. Remember the 3 angels from the alphabet, Sinoi, Sansonoi, and Samangelof? Their names became a standard feature of Jewish protective amulets. You'd hang these amulets over a baby's crib or on the wall of a birthing room. They'd often include a circular border with the angels' names, protective psalms, and sometimes an image of the angels themselves binding Lilith. Some amulets included the phrase, Adam and Eve, barring Lilith. Others showed Lilith in chains, dominated by the angels. The practice spread across the Jewish diaspora, from Babylonia to North Africa to medieval Europe. And it lasted centuries. You can find these amulets well into the 19th and even early 20th century in some traditional communities. This wasn't obscure occult knowledge. This was mainstream folk practice, as common as saying a prayer or lighting a candle. Medieval Lilith doesn't just kill children. She also seduces men. According to rabbinic and Kabbalistic sources, Lilith prowls at night, visiting men while they sleep. She appears in their dreams, causes nocturnal emissions, and, here's the disturbing part, collects the wasted seed to create more demons. This belief was taken extremely seriously. Nocturnal emissions were considered spiritually dangerous, a loss of vital essence and an opportunity for demonic forces to gain power. And Lilith was the prime explanation. She was the succubus, the night visitor, the seductress who came when a man's guard was down. Why does this belief persist? Because it serves a function. Lilith becomes a way to externalize and explain male sexual desire, particularly desire that happens outside the bounds of procreative, marital sexuality. She's the scapegoat for lust, for temptation, for the ways the body acts without the mind's consent. It's not your fault, the tradition seems to say. It's Lilith. She came to you in the night. But there's also a warning here. If you're not spiritually vigilant, if you're not properly married and focused on holiness, Lilith will find you. She's attracted to weakness, to loneliness, to spiritual impurity. She's a moral disciplinary figure, the thing that punishes men who stray, even in their dreams. Now we enter the world of medieval Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, and specifically the Zohar, the foundational text of Kabbalistic thought, compiled in 13th century Spain. In the Zohar, Lilith reaches her full mythological complexity. She's no longer just a folk demon, she's a cosmic force, part of the Kabbalistic system of divine emanations and spiritual realms. The Zohar describes Lilith as a roaming night demon, the mother of evil spirits, and a source of spiritual impurity. She's associated with the other side, the Sitra Achra, the realm of evil and chaos that exists in opposition to divine holiness. She's also deeply sexualized. The Zohar describes her as seductive, beautiful, and dangerous, a figure of erotic power who lures men away from their wives and from spiritual purity. In Kabbalistic mythology, Lilith is often paired with a male demon, either Samel or Asmodeus, depending on the text. This pairing is significant because it creates a demonic mirror of the sacred union between God and the Shekinah, the feminine aspect of the divine. Where the divine union brings blessing, harmony, and life, the union of Lilith and Samel brings chaos, death, and spiritual pollution. Some texts describe Lilith as Samel's consort, the queen of demons ruling beside him over the forces of evil. Others cast her as his seductress, the one who tempts him away from proper order. Either way, she's no longer a lone figure. She's part of a system, a theological explanation for the existence and persistence of evil in the world. In 16th century Lurianic Kabbalah, named after Isaac Luria, a mystic working in Seift, Lilith becomes even more systematized. She's described as the ruler of the female demons, the Lilith. She governs the forces of misdirected desire, death, and spiritual exile. She's associated with the moon, with darkness, with the left side, the side of severity and judgment in Kabbalistic thought. Lurianic texts also develop the idea that Lilith is specifically attracted to men who waste their seed, either through masturbation or nocturnal emission. Every wasted drop of semen creates more demons under her command, strengthening her power in the world. This creates a whole spiritual economy. Human actions, especially sexual actions, have cosmic consequences. Every moral failure feeds the demonic realm. And Lilith is the primary beneficiary. By the late Middle Ages, Lilith is a fully realized figure in Jewish mystical tradition. She is Adam's first wife, the rebellious equal who refused submission. The queen of demons, ruling over evil spirits and misdirected desire. The child killer, preying on newborns and mothers in revenge. The seductress, visiting men in their sleep and stealing their vitality. She's no longer just a name in an incantation. She's a complete mythological character with a backstory, motivations, relationships, and a place in the cosmic order. And crucially, she represents a particular kind of fear of female sexuality that exists outside male control, of desire that can't be contained, of the chaos that comes when the established order is challenged. She's everything patriarchal society fears about women, and everything it can't quite dominate. So how did we get from that Lilith, the demon, the child killer, the night terror, to the Lilith of modern feminism, goddess spirituality, and empowerment? The shift begins in the 19th century with the Romantic movement's fascination with transgressive, demonic figures. Lilith starts appearing in art and literature as a symbol of dangerous beauty and forbidden desire. Think Dante Gabriel Rossetti's painting Lady Lilith, showing a sensuous woman with flowing red hair. But the real transformation happens in the 20th century, particularly from the 1960s onward. Second-wave feminism rediscovers Lilith and sees something very different in her story. Suddenly, her refusal to submit to Adam isn't a cautionary tale, it's a revolutionary act. Her demand for equality isn't blasphemy, it's justice. Her choice to leave Eden rather than obey isn't rebellion, it's liberation. The first American feminist periodical, founded in 1976, was called Lilith. Feminist theology and goddess spirituality movements embraced her as an archetype of the independent woman, the one who refused to be defined by male authority. In this reading, Lilith's demonization isn't her fault, it's what happens when patriarchal culture can't control a woman. She was made into a monster because she demanded to be treated as an equal. Here's the tension: this modern reading of Lilith is powerful, inspiring, and politically potent. But it's also deeply ahistorical. For thousands of years, Lilith was genuinely feared. Parents believed she would kill their children. Men believed she would drain their vitality. Communities used magic to keep her away. The modern symbolic Lilith, the feminist icon, the goddess of autonomy, is almost completely disconnected from the figure that mothers and midwives prayed against for millennia. Does that make the modern interpretation invalid? Not necessarily. Myths evolve. Symbols change. Every generation remakes its demons and heroes in its own image. But it's important to remember what we're doing. We're not recovering the true Lilith, we're creating a new Lilith, one that serves contemporary needs and values. And maybe that's exactly what Lilith has always been, a figure onto which cultures project their deepest fears and highest aspirations about female power, sexuality, and autonomy. From Mesopotamian wind spirit to biblical desert demon to Adam's rebellious first wife to feminist icon, Lilith's story is really the story of how societies imagine the dangerous, the feminine, and the free. So where does that leave us? Lilith is one of the most successful pieces of mythological recycling in history. She survived for 4,000 years by constantly adapting, constantly absorbing new meanings, constantly serving new functions. She started as a nameless class of spirits, then became a named demon, then acquired a backstory, then became a cosmic force, and finally transformed into a symbol of liberation. Each era kept some elements and discarded others. The modern feminist Lilith remembers her refusal to submit but forgets her role as a child killer. The medieval Kabbalistic Lilith developed her as a cosmic principle but retained her ancient function as a threat to infants. What makes Lilith so powerful, I think, is her fundamental ambiguity. She's neither fully good nor fully evil, neither victim nor villain. She's the woman who demanded equality and became a demon for it. She's the mother who lost everything and now takes everything from others. She's the seductress, the rebel, the exile. And in that complexity, in that irreducibility to a simple moral category, she remains endlessly fascinating. Whether you see her as a demon to be feared or a goddess to be celebrated probably says more about your own values and your own moment in history than it does about Lilith herself. Because Lilith, ultimately, is whatever we need her to be. And that's the most powerful magic of all. Going through the first part of this journey, we've traveled with Lilith from the deserts of ancient Mesopotamia through medieval Kabbalah, watching her transform from nameless wind spirit to cosmic demon queen. But that story ended in the medieval period. And now we need to talk about what happened next, because what happened next is, in many ways, even more dramatic than everything that came before. Somewhere between the medieval world and our own time, Lilith underwent her most radical transformation yet. The demon that mothers feared, the seductress that rabbis warned against, the child killer that required amulets and incantations, she became a hero. Today, Lilith is a feminist icon, a goddess, a symbol of empowerment, autonomy, and resistance. Her name appears on jewelry, in tattoos, in spiritual circles, and across social media as a badge of defiance and independence. So how did that happen? How did we get from protective amulets to celebratory invocations? From warding her off to welcoming her in? That's what we're here to explore. This is the story of modern Lilith, and it's really a story about us, about what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget, about how we remake our myths to serve our needs. Let's begin with how Lilith came back into public consciousness after centuries in the shadows. For most of the modern period, let's say from the Enlightenment through the mid-20th century, Lilith was obscure. She wasn't taught in Sunday schools or synagogues. She wasn't in the standard Bible translations. Outside of specialized academic and religious contexts, almost nobody knew who she was. The story of Adam's first wife existed in medieval Jewish texts like the alphabet of Ben Sira and in Kabbalistic writings like the Zohar, but these were esoteric sources, read primarily by scholars and mystics. The average person, Jewish or Christian, had never heard of Lilith. But starting in the 19th century, something begins to shift. Scholars studying comparative mythology and ancient religions start translating and analyzing these medieval texts. Lilith begins appearing in academic works, in encyclopedias of mythology, in studies of Jewish folklore. And then artists discover her. The Romantic movement, with its fascination for the dark, the transgressive, and the forbidden, finds Lilith irresistible. Dante Gabriel Rossetti paints Lady Lilith in 1868, a sensuous red-haired woman combing her hair, embodying dangerous beauty. Writers like George MacDonald and Anatole France incorporate her into fiction. By the early 20th century, Lilith has entered Western literary and artistic consciousness as a figure of dangerous, seductive femininity. But she's still primarily an aesthetic object, a symbol of exotic wickedness, not yet a figure with whom people identify. The real shift, the moment when Lilith transforms from an object of fascination into a subject of identification, comes with second-wave feminism in the 1960s and 70s. Suddenly, People are reading the story of Adam's first wife very differently. Instead of seeing a cautionary tale about disobedience, they see a story about a woman who demanded equality and was demonized for it. Instead of a villain, they see a victim, or better yet, a hero. And once that reading takes hold, once that interpretive door opens, Lilith explodes into popular consciousness. Here's what makes Lilith so perfect for modern reinterpretation. Her story is simple, dramatic, and symbolically loaded. She's created equal to Adam. She demands to be treated as equal. She refuses sexual submission. She speaks a word of power and leaves. And for this, she's cast out, demonized, and turned into a monster. You don't need a PhD in gender studies to see the metaphor there. It's right on the surface. And once the story starts circulating outside its original religious context, once it's detached from the medieval cosmology and the fear of actual demons, it becomes incredibly flexible. Modern readers don't have to believe in demons or Kabbalah or divine names to find meaning in Lilith's story. The narrative structure alone is powerful. Woman asserts autonomy, patriarchy punishes her, she becomes the villain in their story but the hero in her own. By the late 20th and early 21st century, you don't need to dig through obscure medieval texts to find Lilith. She's in books, blogs, podcasts, TikTok videos, Instagram posts. She's been fully democratized, fully accessible. And in that accessibility, in that widespread circulation, she's become something new. Not the Mesopotamian Lilith, not the medieval demon queen, but a thoroughly modern myth, a story we tell ourselves about resistance, about refusing to be diminished, about the price women pay for demanding equality. Let's talk about what feminist readings of Lilith actually look like, because this is where the modern transformation really crystallizes. In 1972, Jewish feminist scholar Judith Plasko published an essay called The Coming of Lilith that reimagines the story entirely. In Plasko's version, Eve eventually leaves Eden too and finds Lilith in the wilderness. The two women talk, realize they've been played against each other, and decide to return to Eden together to confront Adam. This is radical revisionism. It takes the medieval cautionary tale and rewrites it as a story of female solidarity, of women refusing to be divided by patriarchal competition, of collective resistance rather than individual tragedy. And this pattern repeats across feminist literature. Lilith becomes the woman who refused. The woman who said no. The woman who wouldn't make herself smaller, wouldn't perform submission, wouldn't accept inequality as the price of belonging. She's reframed not as rebelling for rebellion's sake, but as standing up for basic dignity. Her demand, that she be treated as Adam's equal since they were both made from the same earth, is presented as simple justice, not dangerous pride. And the fact that she was demonized for this? That becomes evidence of how patriarchy works. When women assert equality, they're cast as dangerous, monstrous, unnatural. Lilith's demonization isn't proof that she was wrong, it's proof that the system was afraid of her being right. One of the most powerful aspects of Lilith's modern reinterpretation centers on the sexual dimension of her story. Remember, the medieval tale has Lilith refusing to lie beneath Adam during sex. She wants equality in the sexual act itself. And for this refusal, for asserting bodily autonomy and sexual preference, she's cast out and demonized. Modern feminist readings make this explicit. Lilith is punished for refusing to accept a sexual position that symbolizes male dominance and female submission. Her insistence on equality isn't abstract, it's embodied, physical, intimate. This makes Lilith a powerful symbol for conversations about consent, about bodily autonomy, about the right to refuse sex or to refuse particular sexual acts. She becomes an archetype of sexual self-determination. Where the medieval tradition condemned her sexuality as dangerous and corrupting, modern readings celebrate it as healthy and empowering. She's not a temptress leading men astray, she's a woman who knows what she wants and refuses to pretend otherwise. This is particularly resonant in an era of conversations about enthusiastic consent, about dismantling coercive sexual norms, about women's right to sexual pleasure on their own terms. Lilith becomes a mythic ancestor for these contemporary struggles. Within Jewish feminism specifically, Lilith has become a particularly important figure. Since the 1970s, she's appeared in Jewish feminist publications, in women's seders, in discussion groups and study circles. The journal Lilith, founded in 1976, became a central voice for Jewish feminism and still publishes today. In this context, Lilith serves a specific function. She's a figure from within the tradition who can be used to critique the tradition. She's not imported from outside, she's already there in the texts, even if marginalized and demonized. And that makes her a powerful tool for internal reform. Jewish feminist theologians and writers use Lilith to ask questions like, what happens to women who don't fit the prescribed roles? What violence is done when women's sexuality is framed as inherently dangerous? What would it mean to reclaim the figures our tradition has cast as demons? Some contemporary Jewish rituals now include Lilith. She might be invoked alongside the matriarchs, acknowledged as a spiritual ancestor, or called upon as a guardian of women's autonomy. This is a radical departure from traditional practice, where she was someone you warded against, not someone you welcomed. Let's talk about what feminist readings of Lilith actually look like, because this is where the modern transformation really crystallizes. In 1972, Jewish feminist scholar Judith Plasko published an essay called The Coming of Lilith that reimagines the story entirely. In Plasko's version, Eve eventually leaves Eden too and finds Lilith in the wilderness. The two women talk, realize they've been played against each other, and decide to return to Eden together to confront Adam. This is radical revisionism. It takes the medieval cautionary tale and rewrites it as a story of female solidarity, of women refusing to be divided by patriarchal competition, of collective resistance rather than individual tragedy. And this pattern repeats across feminist literature. Lilith becomes the woman who refused. The woman who said no. The woman who wouldn't make herself smaller, wouldn't perform submission, wouldn't accept inequality as the price of belonging. She's reframed not as rebelling for rebellion's sake, but as standing up for basic dignity. Her demand, that she be treated as Adam's equal since they were both made from the same earth, is presented as simple justice, not dangerous pride. And the fact that she was demonized for this? That becomes evidence of how patriarchy works. When women assert equality, they're cast as dangerous, monstrous, unnatural. Lilith's demonization isn't proof that she was wrong, it's proof that the system was afraid of her being right. One of the most powerful aspects of Lilith's modern reinterpretation centers on the sexual dimension of her story. Remember, the medieval tale has Lilith refusing to lie beneath Adam during sex. She wants equality in the sexual act itself. And for this refusal, for asserting bodily autonomy and sexual preference, she's cast out and demonized. Modern feminist readings make this explicit. Lilith is punished for refusing to accept a sexual position that symbolizes male dominance and female submission. Her insistence on equality isn't abstract, it's embodied, physical, intimate. This makes Lilith a powerful symbol for conversations about consent, about bodily autonomy, about the right to refuse sex or to refuse particular sexual acts. She becomes an archetype of sexual self-determination. Where the medieval tradition condemned her sexuality as dangerous and corrupting, modern readings celebrate it as healthy and empowering. She's not a temptress leading men astray, she's a woman who knows what she wants and refuses to pretend otherwise. This is particularly resonant in an era of conversations about enthusiastic consent, about dismantling coercive sexual norms, about women's right to sexual pleasure on their own terms. Lilith becomes a mythic ancestor for these contemporary struggles. Within Jewish feminism specifically, Lilith has become a particularly important figure. Since the 1970s, she's appeared in Jewish feminist publications, in women's seders, in discussion groups and study circles. The journal Lilith, founded in 1976, became a central voice for Jewish feminism and still publishes today. In this context, Lilith serves a specific function. She's a figure from within the tradition who can be used to critique the tradition. She's not imported from outside, she's already there in the texts, even if marginalized and demonized. And that makes her a powerful tool for internal reform. Jewish feminist theologians and writers use Lilith to ask questions like, what happens to women who don't fit the prescribed roles? What violence is done when women's sexuality is framed as inherently dangerous? What would it mean to reclaim the figures our tradition has cast as demons? Some contemporary Jewish rituals now include Lilith. She might be invoked alongside the matriarchs, acknowledged as a spiritual ancestor, or called upon as a guardian of women's autonomy. This is a radical departure from traditional practice, where she was someone you warded against, not someone you welcomed. Here's something crucial about many modern retellings: they change the ending. In the medieval alphabet of Ben Sira, Lilith leaves Eden and becomes a demon. She kills babies. She seduces men. She births 100 demons a day. That's the consequence of her refusal, transformation into a monster. But many modern retellings either soften this ending or eliminate it entirely. In these versions, Lilith leaves Eden and that's it. She goes into the wilderness and is free. Or she becomes a wise woman, a wild woman, a woman who lives on her own terms outside of patriarchal civilization. The demonic aspects, the child killing, the nocturnal seduction, the cosmic evil, are quietly dropped. They don't fit the narrative of empowerment, so they're edited out. This is important to notice. The modern Lilith isn't just a reinterpretation of the medieval Lilith, it's a selective one. It keeps the rebellion and discards the consequences. It keeps the refusal and discards the revenge. We'll come back to this tension later, because it's one of the most interesting aspects of how myths evolve. For now, just notice that the modern story is often a significantly abbreviated version of the medieval one. If feminist reinterpretation was the first wave of Lilith's modern transformation, the second wave comes from contemporary paganism, witchcraft, and goddess spirituality movements. Starting in the 1970s and really flourishing from the 1990s onward, practitioners of various forms of contemporary paganism begin incorporating Lilith into their practices, but not as a demon. As a goddess. In Wicca, eclectic paganism, and various forms of witchcraft, Lilith is venerated as a deity or powerful spirit. She's associated with the dark moon, with hidden wisdom, with the wild and untamed aspects of femininity. She's invoked in rituals, honored at altars, and worked with as a spiritual ally. This is a complete reversal of her traditional role. Instead of being the entity you protect yourself against, she becomes the entity you call upon for protection, empowerment, and transformation. In goddess spirituality frameworks, Lilith often represents the dark goddess archetype, not evil, but representing the shadow side, the parts of experience that are difficult, taboo, or suppressed. She's paired with figures like Kali, Hecate, or the Morrigan, goddesses associated with death, sexuality, rage, and transformation. The logic here is that these aspects of existence are necessary. They're not demonic, they're integral parts of the life cycle and the human psyche. And by reclaiming Lilith as a goddess rather than a demon, practitioners are reclaiming the right to acknowledge and integrate these shadow aspects. Something particularly interesting happens in contemporary spiritual practice. Lilith becomes associated with marginalized identities, especially queer and transgender communities. Why? Because she's an outsider. She's the one who didn't fit, who refused to conform, who was cast out for not performing gender and sexuality in the prescribed way. She chose exile over submission. For queer people, for trans people, for anyone whose sexuality or gender expression has been deemed unacceptable by mainstream religious traditions, Lilith offers a powerful point of identification. She's a figure who was demonized for refusing heteronormative, patriarchal sexual roles, and who survived, who thrived, who became powerful in her exile. Some practitioners frame Lilith as a patron of outsiders, of the marginalized, of anyone reclaiming stigmatized forms of desire or identity. She's invoked for protection, for courage, for the strength to live authentically despite social condemnation. This is a far cry from the medieval demon who represented moral danger and cosmic disorder. She's been transformed into a guardian of those whom traditional religion has harmed. If you spend any time in contemporary witchcraft communities, on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, or various online forums, you'll encounter a whole discourse about working with Lilith. This language is important. Not worshipping, not fearing, but working with. It implies a relationship, a mutual engagement. Lilith is treated as an ally, a teacher, a force that can help you grow if you approach her with respect and intention. People share rituals, meditation practices to connect with Lilith, altar setups for honoring her, divination methods for receiving her guidance. They talk about what offerings she likes: red wine, pomegranates, dark chocolate, red candles. They share personal experiences. When I started working with Lilith, I finally set boundaries with my toxic family. Lilith helped me leave an abusive relationship. She taught me that my anger was valid. This is lived spirituality, not abstract theology. People are using Lilith as a tool for psychological and spiritual transformation. She represents the part of themselves that knows their worth, that won't tolerate mistreatment, that's willing to walk away from situations that demand self-diminishment. Here's something crucial: most contemporary practitioners don't necessarily believe in Lilith as a literal external entity. Instead, she's approached as an archetype, a symbolic figure representing certain psychological and spiritual principles. She's the part of the psyche that refuses to submit, the shadow self that contains rage and power, the anima that won't be controlled. This is particularly true in practices influenced by Jungian psychology, which talks about archetypes as universal psychological patterns. In this framework, working with Lilith means integrating the aspects of yourself that she represents: your anger, your sexuality, your refusal, your wildness. You might light a candle to Lilith and say a prayer, but you understand that you're really activating those qualities within yourself. The ritual is symbolic, a way of focusing intention and shifting consciousness, not an attempt to contact an external demonic being. This psychological framing makes Lilith accessible to people who might not be comfortable with more literal forms of deity worship. You don't have to believe in demons or goddesses to find value in engaging with Lilith as a symbolic figure representing female autonomy and power. And this flexibility, this ability to be understood either literally or symbolically, is part of what makes modern Lilith so popular and widespread. Let's talk more specifically about sexuality, because this is where the reversal between ancient and modern Lilith is most dramatic. Remember that in ancient and medieval traditions, Lilith's sexuality was her most dangerous quality. She seduced sleeping men, causing nocturnal emissions. She collected wasted seed to breed demons. She represented sexuality outside of procreative, marital contexts, and therefore sexuality that was threatening, impure, and evil. The medieval mindset saw unregulated female sexuality as fundamentally dangerous. A woman's sexual desire, if not properly contained within marriage and directed toward reproduction, was a source of chaos and moral pollution. Modern reinterpretations flip this completely. Lilith's sexuality is reframed as healthy, natural, and empowering. She's not a succubus stealing men's vitality, she's a woman who knows her own desire and isn't ashamed of it. Contemporary sex-positive feminism embraces Lilith as an emblem of erotic autonomy. She represents the right to sexual pleasure, the right to desire, the right to express sexuality outside of reproduction or male approval. Where the medieval tradition said Lilith's sexuality is dangerous, so women's sexuality must be controlled, modern readings say Lilith's sexuality was called dangerous because patriarchy fears women's autonomy. This is a fundamental reframing. The same evidence, the same stories, the same imagery, are interpreted through an entirely different moral lens. The connection between Lilith and reproductive autonomy is particularly potent in contemporary discourse. Remember, Lilith refused to have sex in a position associated with procreation. She left Eden and, in some traditions, chose to birth demons rather than human children. She was associated with infant mortality, miscarriage, and threats to pregnancy. For centuries, this made her an enemy of mothers and an enemy of fertility. But in contemporary contexts, especially in discussions of reproductive rights, these same associations can be reinterpreted. Some feminist writers connect Lilith to the right to choose not to have children, to choose abortion, to control one's own fertility. She becomes a symbol of reproductive autonomy, the right to decide what happens to your own body, even if society demands that you bear children. Contemporary artwork and essays link Lilith to reproductive justice movements, framing her as a mythic ancestor for anyone fighting for bodily self-determination. This reading makes medieval scholars roll in their graves. Protective amulets against Lilith were used precisely to ensure safe pregnancy and childbirth. But that's exactly the point. By reclaiming the figure who is feared as a threat to reproduction, modern activists are asserting the right to control reproduction. The concept of shadow work from Jungian psychology provides another framework for reclaiming Lilith's darker aspects. In this view, the shadow represents the parts of ourselves that we've repressed, denied, or been taught to be ashamed of. Everyone has a shadow. It contains our rage, our sexuality, our selfishness, our darkness. And psychological health requires integrating the shadow rather than repressing it. Lilith, in this framework, represents the collective feminine shadow, all the qualities that patriarchal culture has taught women to suppress. Anger, sexual desire, ambition, refusal, the willingness to prioritize yourself over others. Instead of seeing these qualities as demonic, shadow work practitioners frame them as necessary. Yes, Lilith is angry, because she was treated unjustly. Yes, she's sexual, because sexuality is part of being human. Yes, she refused, because the alternative was self-betrayal. By engaging with Lilith symbolically, practitioners work on integrating their own shadow material. They practice acknowledging their anger, expressing their desire, setting boundaries, and refusing to people-please at the cost of their own well-being. In this reading, Lilith isn't something to fear or ward off, she's something to welcome back, to integrate, to make peace with. She represents the return of what's been repressed, the acknowledgement of what's been denied. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Lilith has become a recognizable figure in Western pop culture. And this mainstream visibility further shapes her modern identity. She appears in television shows like Supernatural, True Blood, and Lucifer. She's a character in video games, graphic novels, and urban fantasy series. She shows up in everything from Sabrina to Shadowhunters. In these pop culture appearances, Lilith is usually portrayed as powerful, dangerous, and morally ambiguous. She's often depicted as Lucifer's consort, a demon queen, or a powerful witch. She's rarely straightforwardly evil, usually she's complex, with motivations that viewers can understand even if they don't agree with her methods. These portrayals blend biblical and mythological imagery with contemporary themes of female agency and moral complexity. Pop culture Lilith is often a villain, but she's usually the kind of villain you sympathize with, the kind whose anger makes sense even if her actions are extreme. And crucially, she's cool. She's powerful, stylish, confident, and unapologetic. For young viewers especially, she often represents a kind of femininity that refuses to be nice, sweet, or accommodating, and that refusal is coded as attractive rather than monstrous. One of the most significant moments in Lilith's modern cultural presence was the Lilith Fair Music Festival, which ran from 1997 to 1999 and was revived in 2010. Founded by Sarah McLachlan, Lilith Fair was a traveling music festival featuring female and female-fronted acts. At a time when the music industry was heavily male-dominated, Lilith Fair proved that an all-female lineup could be commercially successful and artistically credible. The choice of name was deliberate. Lilith Fair wasn't just a concert series, it was a statement. By invoking Lilith, the festival aligned itself with themes of female independence, resistance to male domination, and the reclaiming of female creative power. For a generation of women in the 1990s, Lilith became shorthand for female artistic community and independence. You didn't need to know the medieval mythology, the festival itself created a new cultural association. Contemporary artists across various media have embraced Lilith as subject matter. Painters depict her in various forms, sometimes as a serpent-entwined temptress, sometimes as a modern woman with tattoos and attitude, sometimes as an abstract embodiment of feminine rage and power. Poets write about her, fiction writers reimagine her story, playwrights stage adaptations that center her perspective rather than Adam's. Performance artists incorporate Lilith into drag performances, burlesque, and various forms of alternative theater. In these artistic contexts, Lilith functions as a symbol of transgression, of crossing boundaries, of refusing to stay in the box that society has prepared for you. She represents fluid identity, sexual liberation, and the right to define yourself rather than being defined by others. This artistic engagement further democratizes and diversifies Lilith's image. She's no longer controlled by religious authorities or academic scholars. She belongs to anyone who finds meaning in her story. Walk into any tattoo parlor or browse Etsy, and you'll find Lilith. Not as a feared demon, but as an aesthetic choice, a cultural emblem, a statement of identity. Lilith tattoos are popular, often featuring serpents, moons, or text reading Lilith in various scripts. People wear necklaces with her name, rings with her symbols, t-shirts with her image. On social media, Lilith energy or Lilith vibes becomes a way of describing a particular attitude: fierce, unapologetic, sexually confident, willing to burn bridges rather than compromise. It's a personality type, an aesthetic category, a vibe. You see profiles with usernames like Daughter of Lilith or Lilith's Child. You see memes about having Lilith in the 8th house, in astrological contexts. You see Pinterest boards dedicated to dark feminine Lilith aesthetic. In these everyday contexts, Lilith has become fully domesticated as a cultural symbol. She's not threatening, she's aspirational. She's not something to fear, she's something to embody, to channel, to express through fashion, body art, and online persona. Interestingly, Lilith has also become increasingly popular as a given name. Parents naming daughters Lilith are making a statement. They're choosing a name associated with strength, independence, and refusal to conform. In everyday usage, saying she's such a Lilith or that's Lilith energy communicates something specific: defiance, independence, refusal to submit, sexual confidence, a willingness to be seen as difficult rather than accommodating. The name itself has become a shorthand, a cultural reference that works even if you don't know the full mythology. It communicates stance more than story, attitude more than belief. This everyday usage shows how far Lilith has traveled from her origins. She's no longer a theological problem or a magical threat, she's a brand, an aesthetic, a way of signaling your values and identity. But not everyone is celebrating modern Lilith's transformation. There's a growing critical conversation about what's been lost in the process of making Lilith into a feminist icon and goddess figure. Some scholars and critics argue that modern Lilith has become a commodified, sanitized symbol that bears little resemblance to the complex, terrifying figure of medieval tradition. Lilith as girl boss is how one critic put it, reducing a figure of cosmic evil and moral ambiguity into something that can be printed on a t-shirt and sold at a music festival. These critics point out that the modern Lilith industry, the books, the jewelry, the courses on working with Lilith, often strips away everything challenging or difficult about her story. She becomes safe, marketable, digestible. The real Lilith of Jewish tradition was never safe. She killed babies. She was genuinely feared. People used magic to keep her away because they believed she could destroy their families. That's not empowering, that's horrifying. By turning her into a symbol of empowerment, are we erasing the very real fear and harm she represented? Are we appropriating a figure from Jewish tradition while ignoring the context and consequences of her original role? Related to this is the critique that modern retellings are highly selective about which parts of Lilith's story they preserve. As we noted earlier, most modern versions keep the Eden rebellion but drop the demonic aftermath. They talk about her refusal to submit to Adam but not about her strangling infants. They celebrate her sexuality but ignore the medieval belief that she collected sperm to breed demons. This is selective myth-making, keeping the parts that fit contemporary values and quietly discarding the parts that don't. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with this. Myths have always been adapted, reinterpreted, and selectively retold. Every generation chooses which aspects of inherited stories to emphasize. But it's worth being honest about what we're doing. We're not recovering the true Lilith or the original Lilith. We're creating a new Lilith that serves contemporary needs, and in the process, we're leaving out substantial parts of what she meant to people for thousands of years. Some critics worry that this sanitization, this removal of everything dark, complex, and morally ambiguous, actually diminishes Lilith's power. The modern Lilith is all righteousness and no revenge, all refusal and no rage, all autonomy and no actual danger. And maybe, these critics suggest, what we need isn't a safe Lilith but one who reminds us that anger has consequences, that refusal comes at a cost, that living outside society's bounds is genuinely difficult and often tragic. The medieval Lilith wasn't just punished for demanding equality, she became something genuinely destructive, genuinely harmful. And maybe there's value in sitting with that darkness, that moral complexity, rather than editing it out for a cleaner narrative. Let's be explicit about the transformation we're documenting, because it's genuinely extraordinary. Ancient and medieval cultures treated Lilith as a literal, external threat. Mothers hung amulets over cribs because they genuinely believed a demon named Lilith might kill their babies in the night. Men worried about nocturnal emissions because they believed Lilith was visiting them, stealing their seed, breeding demons. This wasn't metaphor. This wasn't psychological. This was reality as they understood it. Lilith was a dangerous entity who could harm you and your family. Modern audiences, by contrast, largely celebrate Lilith. She's a hero, an icon, a role model. Her name is associated with music festivals celebrating female empowerment, with feminist publications, with goddess spirituality, with reclaiming stigmatized aspects of female identity. The same figure, the same name, the same basic story, but where one culture saw a threat, the other sees a symbol of liberation. The practices around Lilith have completely reversed. Medieval Jews didn't invoke Lilith, they warded against her. They buried incantation bowls, hung amulets, recited protective prayers. The goal was to keep her away, to prevent her from entering your home, from harming your family. Contemporary practitioners invoke Lilith. They light candles to her, set up altars, perform rituals to welcome her presence. The goal is to connect with her, to channel her energy, to embody her qualities. Where medieval practice said, Lilith stay away, modern practice says, Lilith come close. Where medieval magic sought to bind and banish, modern magic seeks to invite and integrate. And even when modern practitioners talk about protection, they usually mean protection by Lilith, not protection from her. She's been transformed from threat to guardian, from enemy to ally. The reversal around sexuality is particularly stark. Medieval tradition, Lilith's sexuality is dangerous, corrupting, and must be avoided. She represents the threat of sexuality outside marriage, outside procreation, outside male control. Men who encounter her are victims, weakened and spiritually compromised. Modern interpretation, Lilith's sexuality is healthy, empowering, and worth celebrating. She represents sexual autonomy, bodily self-determination, and the right to pleasure. Women who identify with her are reclaiming agency, not falling into sin. Same sexuality, opposite value judgment. What was once proof of her evil nature is now proof of her liberation. This tells us something profound about how different cultures moralize sexuality. The acts themselves haven't changed. What's changed is whether we see female sexual autonomy as dangerous or empowering, whether we frame it as corruption or liberation. In Kabbalistic tradition, Lilith represented cosmic disorder, the other side, the forces of chaos and evil that oppose divine order. She was a spiritual threat, an obstacle to holiness, a source of impurity. In contemporary goddess spirituality, Lilith is integrated into sacred practice. She's honored as a dark goddess, yes, but dark doesn't mean evil, it means the shadow aspects of existence that are necessary for wholeness. Death, transformation, the difficult parts of life that must be acknowledged rather than denied. Where Kabbalah positioned her as something to overcome and transcend, modern spirituality positions her as something to integrate and learn from. This represents a fundamental shift in how we think about darkness, shadow, and difficulty. Rather than seeing them as evil forces to be defeated, contemporary spirituality often frames them as necessary parts of existence that must be accepted and incorporated. Finally, consider who uses Lilith and why. Medieval audiences used Lilith as a warning figure. She was what happened when women refused their proper role, when they prioritized themselves over obedience, when they spoke words they shouldn't speak. She was a cautionary tale about the consequences of female rebellion. She also served as an explanation for tragedy, when a baby died, when a marriage faltered, when men experienced sexual dysfunction. Lilith provided an external cause, a way to make sense of inexplicable suffering. Modern audiences use Lilith as an identification figure. She's someone to admire, emulate, even aspire to be like. Especially for women and queer people who feel constrained by social expectations, Lilith offers a mythic precedent for refusal, for choosing authenticity over acceptance, for surviving and thriving after exile. Where medieval audiences said don't be like Lilith, modern audiences say be more like Lilith. The function has reversed completely. Same figure, opposite message. So what does modern Lilith tell us? Here's what I think. Modern Lilith reveals less about ancient belief and more about contemporary values. She's a mirror, not a memory. She reflects what we fear, what we value, what we're trying to reclaim, and what stories we need right now. When we celebrate Lilith as a feminist icon, we're not accurately describing what medieval rabbis believed. We're using an old story to express contemporary commitments to gender equality, sexual autonomy, and resistance to patriarchal authority. When we invoke Lilith in goddess spirituality, we're not practicing ancient Mesopotamian religion. We're creating new spiritual practices that use old names and symbols to address modern psychological and spiritual needs. And there's nothing wrong with that. This is what humans have always done with myths. We inherit them, we adapt them, we make them serve new purposes. Mythology is living culture, not museum artifacts. But it's worth being honest about the process. We're not rediscovering the real Lilith who was suppressed by patriarchy. The medieval Lilith wasn't a misunderstood heroine waiting to be rehabilitated. She was a figure of genuine terror, associated with real suffering, explained by a worldview that saw demons as literal external threats. What we're doing is creating a new Lilith, and that new Lilith serves us in ways the old Lilith served medieval communities. She helps us make sense of our experiences, express our values, and negotiate our fears and aspirations. Medieval parents feared infant mortality and needed an explanation. Lilith gave them one. Modern women face patriarchal constraints and need a symbol of resistance. Lilith gives them one. Different needs, different Liliths. Both are real in the sense that they matter to the people who use them. Neither is true in any absolute sense. They're both cultural constructions, stories we tell that help us navigate the world. The scholar Regina Schwartz has a great line about biblical interpretation. Every reading is a misreading, but some misreadings are more productive than others. The same is true for mythology. Every generation misreads the myths they inherit. We can't help it, we bring our own concerns, values, and contexts to ancient stories, and those concerns inevitably shape what we see. Modern readings of Lilith keep the rebellion and discard the revenge. They keep the sexual autonomy and discard the demonic seduction. They keep the refusal to submit and discard the child killing. They keep Eden and discard the Red Sea, the angels, the demons. This selective reading creates a cleaner narrative, a more inspiring story, a better symbol for contemporary feminism and goddess spirituality. But it also means we're not engaging with the full complexity of what Lilith represented. We're not sitting with the reality that female power and autonomy were genuinely feared for most of human history, and not without reason in societies where any disruption of the social order could mean disaster. We're not grappling with the fact that the same figure who represents liberation in one context represented death and loss in another. That freedom for Lilith meant terror for others. That her autonomy came at a cost that the medieval tradition insisted we remember. Maybe that's fine. Maybe myths are supposed to be simplified, adapted, made useful for the people who tell them. Maybe we don't need to honor every aspect of medieval demonology to find value in Lilith's story. Or maybe something is lost when we sanitize her. Maybe the power of Lilith isn't in her being purely heroic, but in her being genuinely dangerous. Maybe what we need isn't a safe, marketable Lilith, but one who reminds us that refusing the system comes with real consequences: loneliness, exile, and the risk of becoming what the system says you are. The truth is, Lilith's story isn't finished. She's still evolving, still being remade by each generation that encounters her. In the next decade, who knows what she'll become? Maybe she'll continue deepening as a feminist icon. Maybe she'll be reclaimed in ways we can't yet predict. Maybe new communities will find new meanings in her ancient name. Or maybe, like all myths, she'll eventually fade, replaced by stories that serve the needs of a future we can't imagine. But for now, in this moment, Lilith matters to a lot of people. She gives language to experiences that are hard to articulate otherwise. She provides a mythic precedent for choices that feel impossibly difficult. She says, you can refuse, you can leave, you can choose yourself, and you can survive what comes after. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's what myths are for, not to preserve historical accuracy, but to help us live our lives with more courage, more authenticity, more awareness of our choices and their consequences. If there's one thing I hope you take from this exploration of modern Lilith, it's this: pay attention to the stories we tell about our symbols. Notice what we keep and what we leave out. Ask yourself what needs those choices serve. Because the way we tell Lilith's story reveals what we value, what we fear, and what we're trying to become. She's a mirror, and mirrors show us ourselves, not the world. Thank you for joining me on this journey from ancient Mesopotamia to modern TikTok, from protective amulets to celebratory tattoos, from demon to goddess to icon to aesthetic. Lilith has traveled far. And wherever she goes next, she'll carry with her 4,000 years of transformation, adaptation, fear, and ultimately survival. That's the real power of mythology. Not that it stays the same, but that it endures by constantly becoming something new. Before we finish, let's take a moment to reflect on the complete journey we've traced tonight. We began in the deserts of ancient Mesopotamia, where unnamed wind spirits haunted the boundaries of civilization. We watched as these nameless forces coalesced into a singular figure, acquired a name, entered biblical text as a single fleeting reference, and became a feared presence in protective magic. We saw her gain a narrative in the medieval period, becoming Adam's first wife, the woman who refused to submit and was transformed into a demon. We watched as she was integrated into Kabbalistic cosmology, becoming a queen of demons and a force of cosmic disorder. And then, in our modern era, we witnessed her most dramatic transformation yet, from feared demon to celebrated icon, from threat to ally, from warning to inspiration. The same name, spanning 4,000 years and multiple civilizations. But each era remade her in its own image, according to its own needs and fears and values. That's the power and the danger of mythology. It's infinitely flexible, endlessly adaptable. It can justify oppression or inspire liberation. It can terrify or empower. It all depends on who's telling the story and why. Lilith endures not because she represents some eternal truth, but because she's useful. Each generation finds something in her that speaks to their moment, their struggles, their hopes. And that's not a weakness, that's exactly how mythology works, how it survives, how it matters. The question isn't whether modern Lilith is true to ancient Lilith. The question is whether the stories we tell about her help us live more authentically, more courageously, more honestly. On that question, each person has to decide for themselves. Good night, everyone. And may you find in ancient stories whatever truth you need for tomorrow.